Most people spend 40 years working for money and never once ask why their money isn't working back. That's not laziness. That's not stupidity. That's what happens when nobody teaches you the rules of a game you're already playing. You were handed a script early. Work hard. Save what's left. Spend carefully. Hope it adds up. And for a long time, that script felt reasonable. It felt responsible. It felt like the right way to handle money. It wasn't. It was the way to stay exactly where you are. This isn't a book about getting rich quickly. Quick is a fantasy sold to people who haven't learned patience yet. This is about something slower and more valuable. It's about finally understanding what money actually is, how it actually moves, and why most people lose the game before they realize they were playing it. Here's what's true about money. It follows rules. Not mysterious rules. Not rules that require a finance degree or inherited wealth. Rules that are learnable. Rules that, once understood, make the behavior of money completely predictable. The uncomfortable part is this. Those rules were always available. They weren't hidden in vaults or whispered only to the privileged. They were sitting in plain sight, while most people were too busy working to read them. Every chapter ahead will hand you one of those rules, not as inspiration, not as motivation, as mechanics. Because money responds to mechanics, not enthusiasm. You will recognize some of what's here. That recognition will feel familiar and slightly uncomfortable at the same time. That's the point. Awareness without discomfort is just entertainment. By the end, you won't have a system handed to you. What you'll have is something more durable, a way of seeing how money behaves, why it moves the way it does, and where you've been standing in its way without knowing it. That's enough to change everything, not all at once, but decisively. Let's begin. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The employee mindset is a design feature, not a bug. Nobody built the current system to make you wealthy. They built it to make you useful. That's not cynicism. That's history. The modern employment structure wasn't designed around your financial freedom. It was designed around productivity, predictability, and a reliable labor supply. You showing up every day, exchanging time for a paycheck, is the intended outcome. Not a stepping stone. The destination for the system, not for you. Understanding this doesn't mean the system is evil. It means the system is indifferent. And indifferent systems don't look out for you. They simply run. Here's what the system produces by default. You trade roughly 2,000 hours per year for income. That income covers your expenses, maybe funds a modest savings account, and disappears before the next cycle begins. Repeat for 40 years. At $60,000 a year, that's $2.4 million in gross lifetime labor. Most of it funding someone else's asset column while yours remains thin. The math isn't cruel. It's just honest. The employee mindset isn't about attitude. It's about architecture. It's the belief, usually unexamined, that your financial life is built around earning rather than owning. That the goal is a good salary rather than a growing asset base. That security means a stable job rather than income that doesn't require your presence. This mindset was installed early. School taught you subjects. It did not teach you the difference between an asset and a liability. It did not explain compound interest in practical terms. It did not show you what ownership actually produces over time. It handed you credentials and pointed you toward employers. That wasn't an accident. Educated workers are valuable. Educated owners are competition. The retention beat here is subtle but important. The employee mindset isn't a character flaw. It's a reasonable response to the environment you were trained in. You can't fault yourself for absorbing what was taught, but you can fault yourself for keeping it once you know better. Here's the first uncomfortable financial reality. Discipline without the right structure stays broke. You can be the most responsible, hard-working, frugal employee alive and still retire with almost nothing if the architecture underneath is wrong. Effort inside the wrong system produces effort, not wealth. This is where most financial advice fails people. It tells them to work harder, save more, spend less. All of that is fine. None of it is sufficient. Because the ceiling on earned income is your available hours, and your available hours are fixed. Ownership has no ceiling. When you own an asset, a piece of a business, a rental property, an index fund, intellectual property, that asset produces without requiring your hours. It runs while you sleep. It compounds while you're occupied elsewhere. It doesn't call in sick. It doesn't negotiate for raises. It simply performs according to the rules of the market. The shift from employee thinking to owner thinking isn't about quitting your job. Most people who make this shift keep their jobs for years. The shift is internal first. It's the moment you stop asking how much you can earn and start asking what you can own. Those are entirely different questions. They produce entirely different lives. The worker asks, "What is my salary this year?" The owner asks, "What did my assets produce this year while I was doing something else?" One of those questions has a ceiling. The other doesn't. Here's the second retention beat. Leverage is the mechanism that separates the two. Leverage means your effort, your capital, your knowledge, or your time produces results that exceed what you alone could generate. An employer leverages your labor. A landlord leverages borrowed capital against rental income. An investor leverages time through compounding. In every case, the person who understands leverage wins more than the person who simply works harder. This is not a moral statement. It's a mechanical one. You are allowed to use the same tools. You just have to know they exist and decide to pick them up. The third retention beat is this. The first decision that changes the math isn't a big one. It rarely is. It's usually small and structural. Opening an investment account. Putting $200 a month somewhere it compounds instead of somewhere it disappears. Buying one small asset instead of one more liability. The amount matters less than the architecture. The architecture tells your financial life which direction to move. Most people wait until they have enough money to start thinking like owners. That's the trap. You start thinking like an owner first. Then the money follows the thinking. The employee mindset was never yours to begin with. It was handed to you by a system that needed workers. You can hand it back at any point. The question isn't whether you're capable of thinking differently about money. The question is whether you're willing to accept that the script you were given was written for someone else's benefit. That answer is yours. So is what comes next. Chapter 2. Money has physics. Money doesn't vanish. It relocates. Usually into the account of whoever was paying closer attention than you. This is the first thing to understand about how money actually behaves. It is not mysterious. It is not random. It obeys principles as consistent as gravity. And just like gravity, it doesn't care whether you believe in it. It operates regardless. The physics of money are simple. Money in motion tends to stay in motion. Money at rest tends to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, through inflation, through fees, through the slow erosion of purchasing power that happens when you treat a savings account like a finish line instead of a waiting room. Here's the number that most people never sit with long enough. Inflation, at a modest 3% annually, reduces the real value of idle cash by nearly a third over 12 years. You didn't spend it. You didn't lose it in a bad investment. You simply left it sitting still while the world moved around it. That is an active financial decision. It just doesn't feel like one. Doing nothing with money is a choice. It's just a choice with predictable, uncomfortable consequences. The physics principle underneath this is straightforward. Energy without direction dissipates. Money without direction does the same. It doesn't pile up patiently, waiting for you to get organized. It leaks. Through inflation. Through impulse. Through the quiet accumulation of small expenses that never individually feel significant, but collectively consume everything. Most people experience this as a mystery. Money comes in. Life happens. Money is gone. The mystery feels personal, like some specific failure of character or willpower. It isn't. It's physics. Undirected flow goes wherever the path of least resistance leads. In financial terms, that path almost always leads away from you. Here's the first retention beat. Money always goes somewhere. The only variable is whether you chose the destination or it chose itself. When you don't tell your money where to go, it finds its own way. Into subscriptions you forgot about. Into meals that didn't need to be that expensive. Into the invisible margin between what you earn and what you actually have. The wealthy don't earn dramatically more than everyone else in every case. They lose dramatically less to undirected flow. That discipline, the simple act of assigning every dollar a destination, is one of the most underrated financial skills in existence. Not glamorous, not complex. Just the consistent application of direction over drift. The second retention beat. Idle money is a slow leak, not a safe harbor. This contradicts something deep in the psychology most people carry. The instinct to hold cash, to keep money liquid, to avoid risk by staying still. That instinct feels prudent. It isn't. It's the illusion of safety while the actual value quietly drains. A dollar held in a zero-interest account for a decade is worth less than the dollar you started with. You didn't take a risk. You took a guaranteed loss and called it caution. The market, meanwhile, has historically returned roughly 9 to 10% annually over long periods. Not every year, not smoothly, but consistently enough that the cost of not participating is enormous. The gap between what idle money produces and what invested money produces is not a gap in luck. It's a gap in physics. One is in motion. One is standing still. Only one of them is working. This doesn't mean recklessness. It means understanding that risk is not a binary. It's a spectrum. And on that spectrum, idle cash is not the safe end. It's a different kind of loss, slower and quieter, but just as real. The third retention beat is where this becomes personal. Most people treat their finances reactively. Money arrives, expenses appear. Whatever survives the collision gets loosely saved or aimlessly spent. This is not a budget problem, it's a direction problem. The solution is not restriction, it's architecture. Direction means knowing, before money arrives, where it goes. A percentage to expenses, a percentage to savings, a percentage to assets that generate return. The exact split matters less than the consistency of the structure. Because consistency is what converts small allocations into meaningful positions over time. Here's a simple illustration. Two people earn the same income. One directs $500 a month into an index fund consistently for 25 years at an average 8% annual return. That's roughly $475,000. The other spends the same $500 on things that are already forgotten. At the end of 25 years, one of them has a substantial asset. The other has memories of purchases they can no longer name. Same income, same monthly amount, entirely different outcomes. The only variable was direction. Money doesn't reward emotion. It doesn't respond to intention or desire or the feeling that you deserve more. It responds to structure. It responds to the architecture you build around it. When you create that architecture, money behaves predictably. When you don't, it also behaves predictably, just not in your favor. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is simple. Most financial struggle is not caused by earning too little. It's caused by directing too poorly. That's actually good news. Because direction is something you can change today, with the money you already have, in the account you already own. Physics doesn't require permission. Neither does a decision. The flow of money is always happening. The only question worth asking is whether you're building channels that guide it toward you or gaps that let it run through your hands. Build the channels first. Everything else follows from that. Chapter 3. Your beliefs are a balance sheet. Before you ever opened a bank account, you already had a financial position. It just lived in your head instead of a spreadsheet. Every belief you carry about money, what it means, who deserves it, whether you're the kind of person who keeps it, is already reflected in your financial life with uncomfortable accuracy. Your net worth is not just a number. It's a readout of your psychology. A balance sheet with two columns: what you believe money is, and what money has actually done in your life. Most people never audit that balance sheet. They audit their spending. They track their income. They never examine the operating system underneath both. Here is how it works. Beliefs generate behaviors. Behaviors generate outcomes. Outcomes feel like circumstances, but they're not. They're consequences. The distinction matters because circumstances are things that happen to you. Consequences are things that flow from you. One is outside your control. The other isn't. If you grew up hearing that money is the root of all problems, that belief didn't leave when you got your first paycheck. It went underground. It became an invisible instruction set running beneath your financial decisions, telling you to spend before you save, telling you that holding wealth is dangerous, telling you at the exact moment an investment opportunity appears, that people like you don't do things like that. You followed the instruction without knowing it existed. This is the first retention beat. Every person carries an inherited financial script. That script was written by parents, by early experiences, by the economic environment of childhood. It was not written by you, but it is being executed by you daily in every financial decision you make without fully understanding why. The scripts vary. Some tell people that money is scarce and must be hoarded. Others say money is corrupting and must be kept at arm's length. Some scripts produce chronic overspending as a way of proving that money doesn't control you. Others produce paralytic underinvesting driven by fear of loss. None of them were chosen consciously. All of them have financial consequences that show up in account balances. Here is the financial reality that makes this concrete. Take two people, same city, same employer, same salary for 10 years. At the end of that decade, one has a growing investment portfolio, a small amount of real estate equity, and manageable debt. The other has a higher credit card balance than they started with, no investments, and a vague sense that money is impossible. The difference is not income. It's not opportunity. It's the operating system each person is running. One is executing a script that treats money as a tool to deploy. The other is executing a script that treats money as either a threat or an escape. Neither person chose their script, but only one of them has examined it. The second retention beat. Unconscious financial sabotage is not weakness. It's loyalty. Loyalty to a narrative that was handed to you before you had the judgment to evaluate it. The person who earns a raise and immediately increases their spending isn't undisciplined. They're following an instruction that says comfort is the correct response to surplus. The person who avoids investing because they might lose isn't irrational. They're following an instruction that says loss is catastrophic and stillness is safe. Both instructions were reasonable in the environments that produced them. Both are expensive in the present. Identifying these scripts requires a specific kind of honesty, not self-criticism. Honesty. There's a difference. Self-criticism says you should have known better. Honesty says here's what's actually happening and here's where it came from. One produces shame. The other produces information. Shame doesn't change balance sheets. Information does. The audit works like this. Look at your financial patterns, not your intentions. Intentions are what you tell yourself. Patterns are what your money actually does. Where does surplus consistently go? What triggers spending that you later regret? What categories of financial action do you consistently avoid, and what feeling accompanies that avoidance? The feeling is the clue. Fear, guilt, unworthiness, excitement, relief. Each emotion points to a specific belief operating underneath. Find the belief. Name it. Then ask one question. Is this belief producing outcomes you want, or outcomes you keep trying to explain away? That question is the audit. The third retention beat. Rewiring a financial belief is not a matter of positive thinking. It's a matter of repeated evidence. The brain updates beliefs when reality contradicts them consistently enough, which means the intervention is behavioral before it's psychological. You don't think your way into a new belief about money. You act your way into it, one small financial decision at a time, until the evidence accumulates and the old script loses its authority. Open the investment account before you feel ready. Make the first contribution before it feels significant. Watch it sit there, not disappearing, not punishing you, simply existing as an asset. Do it again next month. The belief that you can't hold wealth begins to soften, not because you told it to, but because your own behavior is now contradicting it with regularity. This is slow. It is not dramatic. It doesn't make for a compelling story at a dinner party. But it is how financial psychology actually changes. Through action that precedes feeling, not action that waits for feeling to arrive first. Here's the uncomfortable summary. Your current financial position is not primarily the result of the economy, your employer, your background, or your luck. It is primarily the result of an operating system you inherited and never audited. That system is running right now. It is making decisions on your behalf while you attribute the outcomes to circumstance. The balance sheet of your beliefs is already written. The question is whether you've read it. Most people haven't, which is why the numbers keep surprising them. Read it. Find what's in the liability column. Start there. Chapter 4. The Hard Work Myth and What Actually Scales. Hard work is necessary. It is also insufficient. And confusing those two things has cost more people more wealth than almost any other single mistake. The myth isn't that hard work is bad. The myth is that hard work is enough. That if you simply apply more effort with more consistency over more years, the math will eventually reward you proportionally. It won't. Because the math doesn't work that way. Effort and return are not linearly connected. Never have been. Look at the structure of physical labor. A construction worker who builds houses for 30 years works extraordinarily hard. Their effort is real, their skill is genuine, and their contribution is undeniable. Yet their financial ceiling is determined entirely by how many hours they can sustain. The moment they stop working, the income stops. There is no residual. There is no compounding. There is only the direct and unforgiving exchange of time for money, repeated until the body won't cooperate anymore. Now look at the developer who built the software platform that manages construction projects across the country. They worked hard too, perhaps harder in the early years. But the work they did in year 1 is still generating revenue in year 10. The effort was front-loaded. The return is ongoing. Same category of hard work. Entirely different financial architecture. The difference is not talent. It's structure. Here's the first retention beat. Effort caps out. Systems don't. A human being has roughly 16 productive hours in a day. That's the ceiling on effort-based income. No amount of discipline, motivation, or hustle breaks through it. But a system, a business, an investment, a product, a platform, has no such ceiling. It runs on its own logic. It compounds on its own schedule. It doesn't require your presence to continue performing. This is not a new idea. It is, however, an idea that most people understand intellectually and ignore practically. Because systems require upfront investment. They require patience. They require tolerating a period where the effort feels disproportionate to the return. And that period is exactly where most people quit and return to the comfort of a predictable paycheck. The paycheck is comfortable. It is also a ceiling disguised as a floor. Here's the financial reality that makes this concrete and slightly uncomfortable. A person earning $80,000 a year who invests $1,000 monthly at an average 8% annual return will accumulate roughly $1.7 million over 30 years. They didn't work extra hours for that money. They didn't take a second job. They simply directed a portion of their existing income into a system that compounded without their involvement. The same person who spends that $1,000 monthly on consumption will have earned the same gross income over 30 years and will have approximately nothing to show for it beyond the memories of whatever they purchased. Same effort. Same income. One directed into a system. One consumed on arrival. The gap between those two outcomes is not hard work. It's architecture. The second retention beat. Leverage is the mechanism that converts 1 hour into many. This word gets used loosely, so here's what it means precisely. Leverage is when your effort, capital, or knowledge produces results that exceed what you alone could generate through direct action. When you invest money, you are leveraging capital. The money works while you don't. When you build a business with employees, you are leveraging other people's time and skills. When you create a product once and sell it repeatedly, you are leveraging your knowledge. In every case, you are breaking the one-to-one relationship between your hours and your income. The wealthy don't have a fundamentally different relationship with effort than everyone else. They have a fundamentally different relationship with leverage. They understand intuitively or learned early that the goal is not to work harder within a fixed structure. The goal is to build structures where the work you do today generates return tomorrow without requiring your daily presence. Most people were never shown how to build those structures, so they worked harder inside structures they didn't own and wondered why the return never scaled. Here's the third retention beat, and it's the one that matters most practically. The shift from effort-based thinking to ownership-based thinking doesn't require quitting your job or having significant capital. It requires asking a different question. The effort-based question is, how can I earn more this month? The ownership-based question is, what can I build or buy this month that will still be producing value in 5 years? Those questions lead to entirely different decisions. The first sends you toward more hours, more clients, more hustle within the existing structure. The second sends you toward assets, toward systems, toward the slow and unglamorous work of building something that outlasts your direct involvement. Start with whatever is available. An index fund contribution, a small business idea executed with genuine discipline, a skill monetized in a way that doesn't require your physical presence every time. The size of the first step is less important than the direction of it. One more thing worth saying plainly. The hard work myth is emotionally seductive because it is morally comfortable. Hard work feels virtuous. It feels like the right way to earn. And it is, as a foundation. But foundations are not structures. You build on them. You don't live inside them. The person who works hard and builds nothing owns nothing. The person who works hard and builds systems owns the compounding difference between those two approaches, accumulating quietly over years until one day the gap becomes impossible to ignore. That gap is not luck. It's not inheritance. It's the predictable result of understanding what actually scales and having the patience to build it, while everyone else is simply working harder. Effort is the entry fee. Systems are the return. Know the difference. Build accordingly. Chapter 5. Rules written in invisible ink. There is a set of financial rules that governs nearly every significant wealth outcome in the modern economy. They are not secret. They are not complicated. They are simply never taught to the people who need them most. That omission is either a failure of education or a feature of it, depending on how charitable you're feeling. Either way, the result is the same. Millions of people play a game with rules they've never read, losing in ways they can't explain to players who learned the manual early. The rules exist in tax law, in investment vehicles, in the mechanics of compound growth, in the structural difference between assets and liabilities. They are available to anyone with a library card or an internet connection. They require no special access. They require only the decision to learn them before the cost of not knowing them becomes too large to ignore. For most people, that decision comes late, sometimes too late. Here's the first retention beat. What financial illiteracy actually costs is not abstract. It's specific and it accumulates. Consider a straightforward example. Two people begin working at 25. One contributes $6,000 annually to a tax-advantaged retirement account. The other keeps the same $6,000 in a standard savings account earning minimal interest. Over 35 years, assuming an 8% average annual return, the first person has roughly $1.1 million. The second has something closer to $210,000 before taxes on the interest. Same income, same discipline. The difference is knowledge of one rule: tax-advantaged compounding. That single piece of financial literacy is worth approximately $900,000 over a working lifetime. Not knowing it doesn't cost you nothing. It costs you nearly $1 million, quietly, without ever announcing itself. That is what invisible rules do. They operate whether or not you're aware of them. The only variable is whether they operate for you or against you. The second retention beat. The gap between earners and keepers is not income. It's rule literacy. There are people earning $200,000 a year who are financially fragile. There are people earning $60,000 a year who are quietly building substantial wealth. The difference is not discipline in the motivational sense. It's the practical knowledge of how to structure income so that more of it stays, compounds, and grows. The rules that govern this are not exotic. They include understanding the difference between pre-tax and post-tax accounts, and which to prioritize at which income levels. They include knowing that a dollar invested in an asset producing income is structurally different from a dollar spent on a liability producing nothing. They include understanding that debt carries different costs depending on what it funds, and that not all borrowing is equivalent. None of this is taught in standard schooling. All of it is available. The people who find it and apply it early accumulate a structural advantage that compounds just like money does. The people who don't find it spend their financial lives wondering why the math never seems to work in their favor. The math works fine. It was just never explained. Here's a specific rule that illustrates this with uncomfortable clarity. The tax code in most developed economies is written with significant advantages for business owners and investors. Expenses that reduce taxable income, depreciation on assets, capital gains rates lower than ordinary income rates. These are not loopholes exploited by the corrupt. They are written rules, available to anyone who understands them, that effectively create a lower cost of wealth building for people who know they exist. The employee pays taxes on gross income before spending. The business owner structures legitimate expenses before calculating taxable income. Over decades, that structural difference compounds into an enormous gap in retained wealth. It isn't fairness. It isn't the point. The point is that the rule exists. It applies to you. And whether it works for you or costs you depends entirely on whether you know about it. The third retention beat. Learning the rules is the first act of financial disobedience. This framing matters. Most people think of financial education as compliance, as doing the responsible thing, as following advice from sensible adults. But there's something more subversive about it than that. When you learn how money actually works, you stop participating in the default outcome. The default outcome is that you work for income. Income covers expenses, the gap is modest, and the system, employers, lenders, advertisers, and tax structures designed around spenders rather than investors, benefits from your financial drift. Learning the rules is how you exit that default. Not dramatically, not angrily. Simply by redirecting your financial behavior toward structures that work in your favor rather than against you. This doesn't require enormous wealth to start. The rules that matter most are accessible at any income level. A tax-advantaged account can be opened with a small monthly contribution. Understanding the difference between a depreciating liability and an appreciating asset costs nothing but attention. Knowing that compound growth requires time, and that time is the one resource you cannot recover. That knowledge is free, and its application is immediate. The people who win financially are not, in most cases, smarter or more talented or harder working than the people who don't. They simply encountered the rules earlier and applied them longer. That's it. That is the entire structural advantage in most cases, which means the advantage is available to you, starting now, with the information in front of you and the decisions that follow from it. One honest caveat. Knowing the rules doesn't eliminate uncertainty. Markets move, tax laws change, investments underperform. The rules don't guarantee outcomes. They improve probabilities. They stack the structural elements of financial life in a direction that favors growth over loss, accumulation over drift, ownership over perpetual earning. That's not certainty. But in a game where most people are playing blind, understanding the rules is an edge so significant it barely requires anything else. Read the manual, not once, continuously. Because the rules evolve and staying current is part of the literacy. The invisible ink was always there. You just needed to know where to hold the page. Chapter 6. Debt, the tool everyone uses wrong. Debt is not the problem. The problem is borrowing money that grows to buy things that shrink. That single distinction separates the people who use debt to build wealth from the people who use debt to fund a lifestyle that quietly dismantles it. The tool is identical. The outcome is determined entirely by what you pointed at. Most people were taught one of two things about debt. Either avoid it entirely, which is emotionally satisfying and financially limiting, or treat it as a necessary evil, something to manage and minimize and feel vaguely guilty about. Neither framing is accurate. Neither produces optimal outcomes. Both miss the actual mechanics of how debt functions in a financial system. Debt is leverage. Leverage amplifies. It amplifies gains when applied to assets that appreciate or generate income. It amplifies losses when applied to things that depreciate or produce nothing. The tool doesn't choose. You choose. And most people, without understanding the distinction, consistently choose the direction that works against them. Here's the financial reality that makes this specific. A $30,000 car loses roughly half its value within 5 years. The depreciation is predictable, steep, and immediate. The moment you drive it off the lot, the asset is worth less than the loan against it. You are paying interest on a shrinking position. The debt grows in cost while the collateral shrinks in value. That same $30,000 invested in a broad market index fund has historically, over any comparable 5-year period with reasonable entry points, produced returns that at minimum preserved value and often significantly increased it. You are not paying interest. You are receiving compounding return. The position grows while you hold it. Same $30,000, pointed in opposite directions. The gap between those outcomes over 20 years is not a rounding error. It's the difference between financial fragility and financial independence. Here's the first retention beat. Liability debt versus leverage debt is the most important distinction in personal finance that almost nobody teaches clearly. Liability debt funds consumption. It pays for things that lose value, that produce no income, that exist purely for present enjoyment at future cost. Credit card balances, depreciating vehicle loans, financing for electronics or furniture or anything else that is worth less the moment you acquire it. This is liability debt. It is expensive. It compounds against you. It transfers your future income to lenders in exchange for present consumption. Leverage debt funds acquisition. It pays for things that generate income or appreciate in value over time. A mortgage on a rental property that produces monthly cash flow exceeding the mortgage payment. A business loan that funds equipment generating revenue. Margin used thoughtfully by a sophisticated investor to amplify a carefully researched position. This debt is a tool of multiplication. It costs interest, yes, but the asset it funds returns more than that interest when selected correctly. The wealthy don't avoid debt. They are often more leveraged than the middle class in absolute terms. The difference is that their debt is almost entirely in the second category. It is working debt. Debt pointed at things that grow, the second retention beat. How the wealthy actually borrow is instructive precisely because it inverts the common pattern. The common pattern is to borrow for lifestyle first: car, vacation, furniture, electronics, and invest with whatever remains, which is usually nothing. The inverted pattern is to borrow strategically for asset acquisition and fund lifestyle from cash flow. A real estate investor doesn't save for 30 years until they can buy a property outright. They use a mortgage, which is borrowed capital, to control an asset worth significantly more than their down payment. That asset appreciates. It generates rental income. The tenant, in effect, services the debt. The investor builds equity in an appreciating asset using other people's money, structured carefully enough that the income exceeds the cost. This is not exotic finance. This is a basic application of leverage that has been used to build wealth for generations. The barrier to understanding it is not complexity, it's exposure. Most people were never shown the mechanics because the people who taught them about money were themselves in the first category, borrowing for consumption and calling it normal. It is normal. Normal and expensive, the third retention beat. There is one question worth asking before any debt decision, and it is simple enough to apply in real time. Does this debt fund something that will be worth more in 5 years or less? If the answer is less, the debt is costing you twice, once in interest, once in depreciation. The combined drag on your financial position is significant and almost entirely avoidable. If the answer is more, the debt requires further analysis, but is at least pointed in the right direction. What is the interest rate relative to the expected return? What is the risk of the asset underperforming? What is the cash flow impact during the holding period? These questions are not complicated. They are simply the questions that almost nobody asks before signing. One more thing about debt that rarely gets said plainly. Your relationship with debt is partly psychological, and the psychology often works against you. Debt feels bad. Owing money feels like vulnerability. So people pay off mortgages aggressively even when the mortgage rate is lower than the return they'd earn by investing the same money. They feel virtuous eliminating debt, while mathematically they are making a suboptimal decision. The mortgage at 4% interest paid off aggressively is money not compounding at 8% in an index fund. The emotional satisfaction is real. The financial cost is also real. Both can be true simultaneously. This is not an argument for carrying unnecessary debt or for taking leverage casually. It is an argument for making debt decisions based on the actual math, rather than the emotional valence of owing versus owning. Debt is a tool. Tools are evaluated by what they build, not by how they feel in your hand. Used without understanding, debt is the mechanism by which financial ambition gets converted into financial servitude, month by month, payment by payment, until the interest consumed exceeds the value ever received. Used with understanding, debt is how ordinary people control extraordinary assets, build income-producing positions, and accelerate timelines that would otherwise require decades of patient saving. The tool is the same. The outcome depends entirely on the question you remember to ask before you pick it up. Worth more or worth less? In 5 years. Answer that honestly every time. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Losing Money. The average investor earns roughly 3 to 4% less per year than the market they're invested in. Not because they picked bad assets, because they picked bad moments to be human. This is one of the most well-documented and consistently ignored facts in personal finance. The market returns approximately 9 to 10% annually over long periods. The average individual investor captures somewhere around 5 to 6% of that. The gap is not fees, though fees matter. The gap is behavior. Specifically, the behavior of people making financial decisions while experiencing fear, greed, impatience, and the overwhelming neurological urge to do something when doing nothing would have been significantly more profitable. The market is not designed to exploit your emotions. It simply does, as a byproduct of being a system where millions of emotionally compromised humans make decisions simultaneously. Fear sells at the bottom. Greed buys at the top. The cycle repeats with remarkable consistency, and every rotation transfers wealth from the reactive to the patient. This is not a moral observation. It's a mechanical one. Patience is an edge in financial markets, not because it's virtuous, but because most people are structurally incapable of maintaining it under pressure. Here's the first retention beat. Panic selling is the single most expensive financial habit in existence, and it feels completely rational in the moment. When markets fall sharply, the psychological experience is not abstract. It is visceral. Your portfolio is down 25%. The news is catastrophic. Every instinct you have says this time is different. This decline won't recover. The responsible thing is to preserve what remains before it disappears entirely. That feeling is evolution. Your nervous system was built to respond to threats with immediate action. Stillness in the face of danger was historically not a survival strategy. But financial markets are not the savannah. The threat that triggers the flee response is not a predator. It's a number on a screen that will, in virtually every historical instance of significant market decline, recover and eventually exceed its previous level given sufficient time. The people who sold during the 2008 financial crisis locked in losses of 40 to 50%. The people who held, or better yet bought more during the decline, recovered fully within a few years and then participated in one of the longest bull markets in history. The difference in outcomes between those two groups was not intelligence or information. It was the ability to override a biological response that was never designed for this particular situation. That ability is learnable, but it requires understanding what's actually happening in your nervous system when the numbers turn red. The second retention beat. The emotional cycle of markets is predictable enough to be named. Optimism builds as prices rise. Excitement grows. Euphoria peaks at the top, precisely when the most people have entered the market and the least upside remains. Then prices fall. Anxiety arrives, denial, fear, desperation. Panic at the bottom, precisely when the most people have exited and the most upside is available. Then prices recover. Relief, optimism again. The cycle repeats. Every step of this cycle produces a predictable emotional response that leads the average investor to do the opposite of what the math suggests. Buy high because everything feels safe and promising. Sell low because everything feels dangerous and lost. Repeat until retirement with significantly less than the market itself produced during the same period. The investors who understand this cycle don't eliminate their emotional responses to it. They simply recognize the responses for what they are: signals about market sentiment, not signals about what to do. When euphoria is everywhere, the sophisticated investor gets cautious. When panic is everywhere, the sophisticated investor gets interested. Not because they're contrarian for its own sake, because they understand that price and value diverge most dramatically at emotional extremes. Warren Buffett's observation that you should be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful is not a clever aphorism. It's a precise mechanical description of where the pricing opportunities are in an emotionally driven market. The people who act on it consistently are not geniuses. They are simply people who have learned to recognize their own emotional responses and delay acting on them long enough to ask whether the math supports the feeling. The third retention beat. Discipline is a financial edge, not a personality trait. This distinction matters because most people think of discipline as something you either have or you don't, as a fixed characteristic, as something admirable but essentially innate. It isn't. Discipline around money is a skill. It is built through systems, through pre-commitment, through the deliberate removal of decision points that would otherwise be made under emotional duress. The investor who sets up automatic monthly contributions to an index fund and does not have the option to pause them impulsively has not become more disciplined. They have removed the moment of emotional decision-making from the equation. The money moves before the market can scare them out of it. The system produces the disciplined outcome without requiring the person to be disciplined in a moment of fear. This is not a workaround. This is how behavioral finance actually works in practice. The best financial decisions are often ones made in advance, when the emotional temperature is low, that remove future choice from moments of high emotional temperature. Automate the contributions. Set the allocation in advance. Establish the rules for when you will and won't make changes. Then enforce those rules not through willpower, but through structural friction that makes impulsive deviation genuinely difficult. The investors who do this consistently outperform the investors who rely on their own judgment in real time, not because they're smarter, but because they've acknowledged something important. In the moment that matters most, when the numbers are falling and the headlines are catastrophic, human judgment is the least reliable tool available. Here's the uncomfortable summary. You are not a rational financial actor. Nobody is. The human brain was not built for the specific demands of long-term investing. It was built for immediate threat response, social comparison, loss aversion, and short-term reward seeking. Every one of those features works against patient wealth accumulation. The solution is not to become a different kind of person. It's to build systems that produce rational outcomes despite irrational impulses. To understand your own emotional patterns well enough to account for them in your financial architecture before they get the chance to express themselves as decisions. Losing money in markets is rarely about the market. It's almost always about the person watching it. Know which one you can control. Chapter 8. Time is the only truly non-renewable asset. You can earn more money. You cannot earn more time. Every financial decision you have ever made was also a time decision. Most people never noticed. This is not a philosophical observation about mortality. It is a mechanical description of how compounding works and why the variable that matters most in wealth accumulation is not income, not intelligence, not market timing. It is when you start. The math on this is so stark, it borders on uncomfortable. $5,000 invested at age 25, left alone at a 9% average annual return, becomes approximately $160,000 by age 65. The same $5,000 invested at age 45 becomes roughly $28,000 by the same date. Same money, same return rate, same destination. 20 years of difference in starting point produces a gap of $132,000 from a single $5,000 decision. That gap is the price of waiting, not the price of poverty or bad luck or insufficient income, the price of waiting, of believing there would be a better time, of telling yourself you'd start when things settled down, when you earned more, when life felt less complicated. Life never feels less complicated. The clock runs regardless. Here's the first retention beat. The compounding clock is the most powerful financial force available to ordinary people and the most consistently wasted. Compounding means your returns generate their own returns. The growth compounds on itself. In the early years, this feels insignificant. The numbers are small. The progress feels slow. This is the period where most people lose patience and either stop contributing or never start. This is precisely backwards. The early years of compounding are not the unimportant years. They are the foundational years. They are when the base is established that everything else multiplies from. A dollar invested at 25 does not contribute equally to your retirement wealth as a dollar invested at 45. The 25-year-old dollar has 40 years to compound. The 45-year-old dollar has 20. At 9% annual return, the 25-year-old dollar is worth roughly 6 times what the 45-year-old dollar produces by retirement. 6 times. From the same dollar. The only difference is time. When people say they'll start investing when they have more money, they are trading their most valuable financial resource, time, for the comfort of waiting until the amount feels significant. The amount is never the point. The time is the point. A small amount started early beats a large amount started late with such consistency that the math eventually becomes an argument you cannot make a countercase to. Start small. Start now. The second part of that instruction matters more than the first. The second retention beat. Buying back time through ownership is the end game that most financial advice gestures toward without explaining clearly. The reason wealthy people pursue passive income, investment returns, and business ownership is not primarily to accumulate more money. It is to decouple their time from their income. When your income requires your presence, your time is not yours. It belongs to the structure that produces the income. Every hour you're not working is an hour you're not earning. Your time is effectively rented to someone else's system in exchange for a wage. When your income comes from assets, the relationship inverts. The assets work. You don't have to. Your time becomes available for whatever you choose. More work, more building, more living, more nothing. The point is, the choice exists. That choice is what financial freedom actually means in practice. This is not a distant, abstract goal reserved for people with extraordinary circumstances. It is a mathematical outcome that becomes available at the point where your passive income exceeds your expenses. That point has a specific number attached to it. For most people, that number is not as large as they assume, and not as unachievable as they've been led to believe. The 4% rule, derived from decades of market research, suggests that a portfolio can sustain indefinite withdrawals of 4% annually without depleting itself. Which means financial independence requires a portfolio equal to 25 times your annual expenses. If you spend $40,000 a year, you need $1 million in invested assets. If you spend $60,000, you need $1.5 million. These are specific numbers, reachable numbers, numbers that time and consistent investment make increasingly inevitable. The people who reach them are not exceptional earners. They are people who understood early that time was the variable worth protecting and acted accordingly. The third retention beat is the one that should produce urgency rather than guilt. Every year of delay is not just a year lost. It is a year of compounding lost. And compounding years in the early period are worth dramatically more than compounding years later. Consider what 1 year of delay costs at different points. At 25, delaying 1 year of a $500 monthly contribution costs you not $6,000 in principal. It costs you the compounded value of that $6,000 over 40 years, which at 9% is roughly $188,000. 1 year, $500 a month, $188,000 consequence. That number is not meant to produce paralysis. It is meant to produce clarity about what waiting actually costs in terms that are concrete rather than motivational. The cost of delay is not abstract. It is specific, calculable, and significantly larger than the amount delayed. This is why the wealthy don't wait for conditions to be perfect. They act with imperfect information, imperfect timing, and imperfect amounts, because they understand that the cost of waiting for perfect consistently exceeds the cost of starting imperfectly. Here's the honest, uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all of this. Most people think about money in terms of amounts. How much do I have? How much do I earn? How much do I need? But the people who build wealth think about money in terms of time. How long has this been compounding? How many years until this position becomes significant? How much time am I buying with this decision? The shift from amount thinking to time thinking is the shift that changes behavior. Because when you see time as the scarce resource and money as the tool you use to protect it, your financial decisions reorganize themselves around a different priority. You don't spend the $5,000 on the vacation that will be forgotten in 3 years. You invest it and buy 40 years of compounding that will fund decades of freedom. Not because the vacation has no value, because you've done the math on what that specific $5,000 is actually worth when you understand what time does to it. You cannot create more time. You can use money to free the time you already have, but only if you start early enough for the math to work in your favor. The clock is running. It was running before you opened this chapter. It will keep running after you close it. The only question worth asking is what the time you still have is going to compound into. Chapter 9: How Value Actually Moves Money. Money doesn't follow need. It follows value. This is uncomfortable because need feels like it should matter. The market is indifferent to how much you need it. This single distinction explains more financial frustration than almost anything else. The person working 2 jobs to make ends meet needs money urgently and demonstrably. The person who built a software tool that saves companies 3 hours a week needs nothing urgently. The market sends money to the second person anyway. Not because the system is cruel, because the system is mechanical. It routes money toward value with the same indifference that gravity routes water downhill. Understanding this doesn't require accepting it as just or fair. It requires accepting it as operational. Because once you understand how value actually moves money, you can position yourself in its path, rather than standing beside it, wondering why it keeps passing you. Value is not effort. This is the first and most important clarification. Effort is input. Value is output as perceived by the person paying for it. The two are related but not equivalent, and the gap between them is where most income frustration lives. A surgeon who performs a 2-hour procedure that saves a life delivers extraordinary value. The market pays accordingly. A laborer who works 8 hours moving materials delivers genuine effort. The market pays significantly less. Not because the effort is less real, but because the output is less scarce, less specialized, and less directly connected to an outcome the buyer urgently needs. The uncomfortable implication is this: if your income feels insufficient relative to your effort, the problem is rarely the effort. It is the perceived value of the output. And perceived value is something you can influence, position, and redesign. Here's the first retention beat. Value is a signal, and you control the signal's strength. The same skill, knowledge, or capability can be worth dramatically different amounts depending on how it is positioned, who it reaches, and how clearly its outcome is communicated. A financial advisor managing $100,000 in assets charges a percentage that produces modest income. The same advisor who packages their methodology into a course, a book, or a subscription service reaches thousands of clients simultaneously without proportionally increasing their time investment. The knowledge is identical. The delivery mechanism is different. The income multiple is enormous. This is not a trick. It is the application of leverage to value creation. The question is not only what value you can create, but how many people you can deliver it to without requiring your direct presence every time. That question separates income that scales from income that caps. Most people never ask it. They optimize within their current delivery mechanism rather than questioning the mechanism itself. They work harder within a structure that has a fixed ceiling rather than examining whether the structure itself is the limitation. The second retention beat. The difference between the highest paid and the merely competent in any field is rarely the gap in underlying skill. It is almost always the gap in positioning. Positioning means placing your value where demand is highest, scarcity is greatest, and the connection between your output and the buyer's urgent need is most direct. A writer who produces content for general audiences earns content rates. A writer who produces highly specific technical documentation for regulated industries earns multiples of that rate. The writing skill may be comparable. The positioning is entirely different. One is in a crowded market with low scarcity. The other is in a narrow market with high demand and few qualified suppliers. The highest paid people in any industry are not working harder than the median. They have positioned their output at the intersection of high demand, high scarcity, and high urgency. Finding that intersection requires studying the market rather than simply developing the skill. Both matter. Only one of them determines the price. Here's a financial reality that makes this concrete. The Bureau of Labor Statistics consistently shows that median wages across most industries have grown modestly over decades, while the income of the top earners in those same industries has grown dramatically. The divergence is not primarily explained by education or hours worked. It is explained by leverage and positioning. The top earners figured out how to convert their expertise into scalable output. They wrote the book, built the platform, launched the firm, created the product. They stopped selling hours and started selling outcomes. The market, which is entirely indifferent to effort and acutely responsive to value, routed money toward them accordingly. The third retention beat. Redesigning what you offer so money follows. It is a practical exercise, not a philosophical one. It begins with a specific question. What problem do I solve, for whom, and how urgently do they need it solved? Vague answers produce vague income. I help people with their health. I assist companies with efficiency. I create content for brands. These are descriptions of effort, not value propositions. They do not signal scarcity. They do not communicate urgency. They do not tell the market why the specific outcome you produce is worth paying significantly for. Specific answers produce specific income. I reduce client acquisition costs for B2B software companies by restructuring their sales funnel. I help post-surgical patients return to full mobility 40% faster through a specific rehabilitation protocol. I produce financial reporting that reduces audit preparation time from 3 weeks to 4 days for mid-size manufacturing firms. These descriptions name the outcome, specify the recipient, and imply the cost of not having the solution. The market responds to that specificity because it makes the value calculation obvious. The buyer doesn't have to imagine why they need you. You've already connected your output to a problem they're actively trying to solve. The sharper your value proposition, the stronger your earning signal. The stronger your earning signal, the more directly money flows towards you rather than around you. One more dimension of this that rarely gets discussed plainly. The people who earn the most are not always the most talented. They are almost always the most legible. Legibility means your value is easy to understand, easy to communicate, and easy to connect to an outcome the buyer cares about. Talent that cannot be explained earns less than moderate skill that is perfectly positioned and clearly communicated. This is not an argument against developing genuine expertise. It is an argument for developing the capacity to translate that expertise into terms the market can immediately recognize and compensate. The market does not reward mystery. It rewards clarity. Understand precisely what value you create. Understand precisely who needs it most. Deliver it in a form that reaches them without requiring your direct presence every single time. That is the architecture of income that grows. Everything else is just effort looking for a ceiling to bump against. Chapter 10. The Income Trap and the Asset Exit. Income is not wealth. It is cash flow. Wealth is what remains when you stop working. Most people spend their entire financial lives optimizing the wrong variable. This distinction sounds simple. Its implications are not. The person earning $150,000 a year with no assets is one unexpected event away from financial collapse. A layoff, a medical emergency, a prolonged market disruption. Any of these converts a high income into a crisis almost immediately because the income was the entire structure. Remove it, and nothing remains underneath. The person earning $60,000 a year with $500,000 in income-producing assets is in a fundamentally different position. Their income is supplemented by returns that don't require their presence. Their financial life has depth. Remove the job and the structure doesn't collapse. It bends. There is something underneath to land on. Same society, same economy. Dramatically different resilience. The difference is not luck or inheritance in most cases. It is the decision, made at some specific point, to redirect income toward asset accumulation rather than lifestyle expansion. That decision is available at almost any income level. Most people never make it because nobody framed the choice clearly enough, early enough, to interrupt the default. Here's the default. Income arrives. Lifestyle expands to meet it. Expenses absorb the raise. The promotion funds the nicer apartment. The bonus disappears into consumption that felt earned and probably was. The income grows over a career. The assets don't. Retirement arrives and the primary financial asset is a social security check and whatever modest savings survived the lifestyle. This is not a failure of character. It is the predictable outcome of optimizing income without simultaneously building the asset column. The system is designed to convert your income into consumption. Advertising, credit availability, social comparison, the cultural equation of spending with success, all of it pushes in the same direction. Spend what you earn. Borrow to spend more. Repeat. The exit from this pattern is structural, not motivational. Here's the first retention beat. Active income is necessary and limited. Passive income is optional until it isn't. The distinction between them is simple. Active income requires your time and presence to generate. Stop showing up and it stops arriving. Passive income is generated by assets, systems, and investments that operate independently of your daily presence. Stop showing up and it continues. Every financially resilient person has some ratio of passive to active income. The specific ratio matters less than the direction of travel. Are you building the passive column, or is it still at zero? If it's at zero, your entire financial life depends on your continued ability to show up and perform. That is a fragile position, regardless of how high the income number is. The transition from zero passive income to some passive income is the most important financial threshold most people never cross. Not because the amounts are initially significant. They aren't. Because the architecture changes. You now have a structure that produces without requiring you. That structure can be built upon. It compounds. It creates optionality that pure income never produces. The second retention beat. Building the first asset is the inflection point, and it is more accessible than most people believe. An asset, in the relevant sense, is anything that puts money into your pocket without requiring your direct labor every time it does so. This includes index funds generating dividend income and long-term capital appreciation. It includes rental property generating monthly cash flow above carrying costs. It includes a business with systems that operate without your constant presence. It includes intellectual property, a book, a course, a piece of software that generates licensing or sales revenue repeatedly from a single creation effort. The first one is the hardest. Not because of the financial mechanics, but because it requires redirecting money that could have gone to consumption towards something that produces nothing immediately visible. The lifestyle doesn't upgrade. The purchase doesn't happen. The vacation gets deferred. The money goes into a position that sits there, apparently doing nothing, while compounding quietly beneath the surface. This period, between the first asset purchase and the point where the asset produces meaningful income, is where most people lose conviction. The sacrifice is real and present. The return is abstract and future. The emotional math of that trade-off favors consumption in the short term almost every time. The people who cross the threshold anyway are not unusually disciplined. They simply have a clear enough picture of the alternative, the income trap, the fragile high earner, the retirement that never quite arrived, to make the deferred gratification feel like the more comfortable choice. Here's a number worth sitting with. A $200,000 portfolio invested in assets returning 7% annually generates $14,000 per year without requiring a single additional hour of work. That is not retirement income. But it is a meaningful supplement that reduces your dependence on active income and begins the structural shift away from the trap. Getting to $200,000 in invested assets at a median income with consistent direction and reasonable timeline is achievable within a decade for most people who choose to prioritize it. Most don't. Not because they can't. Because the default is more comfortable in the short term, and the cost of it is invisible until it isn't. The third retention beat. The exit strategy is the plan most people never make. The income trap has an exit. It requires knowing where you're going specifically enough to make decisions that lead there. What is your target portfolio size? What annual passive income does that portfolio need to produce to cover your actual expenses? What is the gap between your current asset position and that target? What monthly investment closes that gap within a timeline that feels genuinely achievable rather than theoretically possible? These are not complicated calculations. They take approximately 15 minutes with a spreadsheet or a basic financial calculator. The vast majority of people in the income trap have never done them. Not because they lack the ability, but because the default doesn't require it, and the calculation, once done, creates an obligation to act differently. That obligation is uncomfortable. It makes the subscription service feel like a choice rather than a necessity. It makes the upgraded apartment feel like a trade-off rather than a reward. It makes every spending decision visible as either a step toward the exit or a step away from it. That visibility is the point. Not to produce guilt, to produce information. Because decisions made with accurate information about their actual cost tend to be better decisions than decisions made in the comfortable blur of the default. The income trap is not inevitable. It is a path that looks like the only path until you learn to read the map. There is an exit. It requires building assets deliberately, consistently, and early enough for the math to cooperate. Start with one. The second follows more easily than the first. The third more easily than the second. The architecture builds on itself until the passive column is no longer supplemental, until the job becomes optional, until the financial life you have is the one you designed rather than the one that assembled itself while you were busy earning. That is the exit. It was always there. Chapter 11. Freedom is a number. Most people want financial freedom. Almost none of them have ever calculated what it actually costs. That gap between wanting something and knowing its specific price is where decades of financial drift live. You cannot move toward a destination you haven't defined. You cannot make decisions that serve a goal you've never quantified. And you cannot know whether you're making progress toward freedom if freedom remains a feeling rather than a figure. Freedom is a number, a specific, calculable, achievable number that most people could determine in under 10 minutes and almost never do. Here's the arithmetic. Financial independence means your investments generate enough annual return to cover your living expenses indefinitely. The research behind this is called the 4% rule, derived from decades of market data examining sustainable withdrawal rates from diversified portfolios. The rule states that a portfolio can sustain annual withdrawals of 4% without depleting itself over a 30-year period in the vast majority of historical market scenarios. The implication is direct. Divide your annual expenses by 0.04. The result is your financial independence number. The portfolio size at which work becomes optional. If you spend $40,000 a year, your number is $1 million. If you spend $60,000, your number is $1.5 million. If you spend $80,000, your number is $2 million. These numbers feel large until you understand what consistent investment over time actually produces. Then they feel like targets rather than fantasies. The first retention beat. The clarity problem is the primary obstacle between most people and financial independence. Not income, not market returns, not circumstance. Clarity. The person who knows their number makes different decisions than the person who doesn't. They see every financial choice through a specific lens. Does this bring me closer to $1 million in invested assets or further from it? That question, asked consistently, reorganizes spending priorities, investment behavior, and timeline planning in ways that vague aspiration never can. The person without a number makes financial decisions in a vacuum. They save when it feels comfortable and spend when it feels justified, and hope the balance at retirement is adequate. That hope rarely produces the outcome they wanted, because hope is not a strategy and comfort is not a compass. The number converts hope into arithmetic. Arithmetic is actionable. Hope is not. Here is what the arithmetic actually looks like for a median income earner. Someone earning $55,000 annually who saves and invests $700 a month, roughly 15% of gross income, at an average 8% annual return will accumulate approximately $1 million in 30 years. They will reach financial independence not through extraordinary income or perfect market timing, but through knowing their target and directing their behavior toward it consistently for long enough that compounding does the heavy lifting. That is not a fantasy. That is math applied to a decision made with clarity. The second retention beat. Defining the actual target changes behavior immediately and measurably. This is not motivational speculation. It is a documented behavioral phenomenon. Specific goals produce specific actions. Vague goals produce vague actions. The precision of the target directly influences the precision of the behavior that pursues it. When you know your financial independence number, several things happen almost automatically. You begin tracking your portfolio balance relative to that number, and the percentage complete becomes a meaningful metric rather than an abstract total. You begin calculating how much monthly investment is required to reach the target by a specific date, and that calculation makes the monthly contribution feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. You begin evaluating spending decisions against their actual cost in terms of timeline impact rather than their immediate dollar amount. A $15,000 car upgrade is not $15,000 when you understand it as a number. It is $15,000 removed from a compounding position, which at 8% over 20 years is roughly $70,000 in future portfolio value. Whether the upgrade is worth $70,000 in delayed freedom is a genuine question. It might be. But most people never ask it because they never did the calculation that makes the trade-off visible. Visibility changes decisions. Not always, not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter across a financial lifetime. The third retention beat. Moving toward a specific number changes behavior in ways that moving toward a feeling never does. This is the operational difference between financial planning and financial wishing. Financial wishing sounds like, I want to be comfortable when I retire. I want to not worry about money. I want to have enough. These are not goals. They are preferences. They produce no specific action because they have no specific standard against which action can be measured. Financial planning sounds like, my independence number is $1.2 million. My current portfolio is $180,000. The gap is $1.02 million. At $1,100 per month invested at 8% return, I close that gap in approximately 22 years, reaching independence at age 57. That timeline can be shortened by increasing the monthly contribution, reducing annual expenses which lowers the independence number, or achieving higher returns through more aggressive allocation in earlier years. These are decisions. Specific, evaluable, adjustable decisions. The person making them is navigating. The person making wishes is drifting. Navigation is available to anyone willing to do 10 minutes of arithmetic. Here is the honest observation that sits underneath this entire chapter. The reason most people never calculate their financial independence number is not mathematical incompetence. It is emotional avoidance. The calculation makes the current position undeniable. It shows the gap clearly. It reveals exactly how many years of current behavior are required to close it, and that timeline is often longer than feels comfortable to acknowledge. So people don't calculate. They keep the goal soft and the distance vague because vagueness is emotionally easier than a number that demands a response. But vagueness has a cost. The cost is the decades spent moving in an undirected way toward an undefined destination and arriving somewhere you didn't choose because you never chose anywhere specific. The number is uncomfortable. It is also the only version of the goal that is reachable. You cannot arrive somewhere you've never aimed for with sufficient precision to actually navigate toward it. Calculate your number. Today. Not as an exercise in financial planning theory, as the first act of taking the goal seriously enough to give it a price. Once the price exists, the path to it becomes a question of arithmetic and patience rather than hope and circumstance. Those are entirely different games. One of them you can win. Chapter 12, The Language of Ownership. Workers earn, owners accumulate. The gap between those two outcomes widens every year, and it is structural rather than personal. Understanding why is the first step toward changing which side of it you're on. The structure is straightforward. When you work for income, you are converting time into money at a fixed rate. The money arrives, covers expenses, and the cycle repeats. Your financial position advances incrementally if you're disciplined, stagnates if you're not, and resets almost entirely if the income stops. The ceiling on this model is your available hours multiplied by your hourly rate. Both are finite. When you own assets, the model is different at a fundamental level. Ownership means a portion of your financial position is generating return independent of your time. The asset works. You don't have to. And because the asset's return can be reinvested to generate further return, the position compounds rather than simply accumulating. The ceiling on this model is theoretically absent. This is not a philosophical distinction. It is a mechanical one with measurable consequences. In the United States, the top 10% of earners own approximately 93% of all stocks. That concentration is not primarily the result of income inequality, though income plays a role. It is the result of a gap in financial literacy about ownership and who understood early that owning produces a fundamentally different outcome than earning. The people in that 10% are not categorically different from the people outside it. They understood the language of ownership and began speaking it earlier. That's the gap. And unlike income, which is largely determined by external factors, the decision to think and act like an owner is available at almost any financial starting point. Here's the first retention beat. Thinking like an owner is possible on any income. This is the part of the ownership conversation that most financial education gets wrong by omission. It presents ownership as something you graduate into after accumulating sufficient wealth. Save enough, then invest. Earn enough, then buy assets. Reach a threshold, then begin thinking like an owner. This sequence is backwards. The thinking precedes the accumulation. The owner's mentality applied to a modest income produces asset accumulation. The worker's mentality applied to a high income produces lifestyle inflation. The mental model determines the financial trajectory far more than the starting income does. Thinking like an owner means asking about every dollar that passes through your hands, whether it can be deployed into a position that returns more dollars without requiring your direct labor. It means evaluating purchases not just by their immediate cost, but by their opportunity cost. What that money would produce if invested rather than spent. It means orienting financial decisions around building a portfolio of positions, rather than maximizing current consumption. This thinking is available to you right now, with the income you currently have, with the assets you currently own, which may be none. The thinking itself has no minimum investment requirement. The second retention beat. Micro-ownership is the entry point that most people overlook entirely. Ownership does not mean starting a business or buying real estate or accumulating the kind of capital that produces meaningful passive income immediately. Those are endpoints. The entry point is considerably more accessible. Fractional shares allow you to own a piece of any publicly traded company for the price of $1 in some cases. An index fund purchase of any size makes you a partial owner of hundreds or thousands of companies simultaneously. A small stake in a colleague's business venture, structured correctly, is ownership. A piece of intellectual property, a written guide, a digital template, a simple piece of software that generates even modest recurring revenue is ownership. None of these require significant capital to initiate. All of them establish the mental architecture of an owner. All of them produce the experience, however small in initial scale, of money working rather than only you working. That experience is the beginning of a different relationship with how wealth is built. The size of the first ownership position is almost irrelevant. What matters is that it exists. That you have skin in a game where the return is not tied to your hours. From that starting point, the position can be built upon. Contributions compound. Understanding deepens. The ownership column of your financial life begins to have entries where previously it had none. The third retention beat. The first ownership decision is the one that changes everything structurally, even when it changes nothing materially. This sounds paradoxical. It isn't. The material change from a first small investment is negligible. A $1,000 position in an index fund does not meaningfully alter your financial life in year one. But the structural change is significant. You are now an investor. You now have a position that produces return without requiring your labor. You now have a reason to understand how markets work, how compounding operates, and how ownership scales. You now have a reference point against which future investment decisions can be evaluated. The identity shift from worker to investor worker is not trivial. It changes how you read financial news. It changes how you evaluate spending decisions. It changes what questions you ask about your income. It changes what you notice in the world around you, specifically the assets generating return for their owners, while those owners are doing something else entirely. This shift cannot happen while the ownership column remains at zero. It requires an entry. The entry requires a decision. The decision requires understanding why it matters enough to prioritize over the consumption that money could have funded instead. Here's the honest summary of what ownership actually produces over time. A person who begins investing $400 a month at age 30 and increases that contribution modestly as income grows will, by conventional retirement age, own a portfolio producing passive income that exceeds what many people earn from active work. They won't look wealthy during the accumulation period. They won't drive the impressive car or live in the aspirational neighborhood. They will be quietly building a position that eventually buys them something no income can directly purchase, time that belongs entirely to them. The people who look wealthy are frequently not. The people who are wealthy frequently don't look it. The gap between appearance and actual net worth is where most financial mistakes live, both in the direction of spending to appear wealthy and in the direction of underestimating how accessible genuine wealth accumulation actually is. Ownership is a language. Like any language, it becomes fluent through consistent use. Start with the first word. The sentence follows. The paragraph after that. Eventually, you stop translating and simply speak it. Chapter 13. What wealth actually looks like from the inside. Wealth doesn't look the way most people imagine it. That gap between the image and the reality is where enormous amounts of money get wasted trying to perform a version of success that the genuinely successful rarely actually live. The visual language of wealth, the cars, the watches, the addresses, the visible markers of arrival, is largely a performance put on by people who are either genuinely wealthy and enjoy the display, or more commonly, people who are approximating wealth through consumption, while the actual financial position underneath tells a different story entirely. The genuinely wealthy are, in a disproportionate number of cases, invisible. They drive ordinary cars. They live in neighborhoods that are comfortable, but not ostentatious. They don't announce their net worth through their wardrobe. They are quiet in ways that would disappoint anyone who expected wealth to look like the version sold in advertising. This is not universally true, but it is true enough to be instructive. Because the people spending most aggressively to signal wealth are, structurally, moving in the opposite direction from it. Every dollar spent on appearance is a dollar not compounding in a position that produces return. The performance of wealth and the accumulation of wealth are, at the margin, in direct competition with each other. Here's the first retention beat. Wealth is optionality, not display. This is the most important reframe in this entire book, and it is one that almost no external signal about someone's financial life will tell you. Optionality means choice. Specifically, the ability to say no to things you don't want and yes to things you do, without the decision being constrained by financial necessity. The person with genuine wealth wakes up and chooses how to spend their day. Not perfectly, not without constraint, but with a degree of agency over their time that the person dependent on active income simply does not have. That choice is invisible from the outside. You cannot see it in what someone drives or wears or where they vacation. You can only see it in how they talk about their time and their obligations. The genuinely wealthy tend to be selective about their commitments in ways that occasionally read as arrogant, but are actually structural. Their time is not for sale at any price because they don't need to sell it. That is what financial independence actually produces in daily lived experience. Compare that to the high earner whose lifestyle requires their income to continue. Every commitment they make is constrained by the need to maintain the income that supports the life. They cannot easily say no to the client they dislike, the employer who undervalues them, the city that doesn't suit them. The income requirement makes the cage. The lifestyle fills it. The financial position looks impressive from outside. The actual freedom available inside it is considerably less than it appears. The second retention beat. The real markers of wealth are time freedom, low financial anxiety, and the absence of dependency on a single income source. None of these are visible. All of them are measurable. Time freedom means your hours are not fully committed to income generation. You have margin. You have days or weeks where no obligation to an employer or client exists. You can be ill without financial consequence. You can take an opportunity that requires 6 months of attention without first calculating whether you can afford to. Your time is genuinely yours in a way that most people experience only on weekends and call vacation. Low financial anxiety means your baseline stress about money is minimal, not absent. Wealth doesn't eliminate the need to make financial decisions. It simply raises the floor of the decisions being made. But the low-grade chronic anxiety of wondering whether this month's income covers this month's expenses, whether the unexpected bill will create a cascading problem, whether the job loss would be survivable, that anxiety is gone. The floor is high enough that ordinary fluctuations don't threaten the structure. Absence of dependency on a single income source means your financial life has multiple pillars: investment returns, business income, rental income, royalties, dividends. The specific sources vary, but the principle is consistent. No single point of failure can collapse the entire structure. This redundancy is what converts financial comfort into financial resilience. And resilience, not the size of the number, is what actually produces the feeling of security that wealth is supposed to deliver. The third retention beat, the quiet shift when money stops being a threat, is the psychological outcome that nobody talks about because it is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It is not euphoria. It is not the feeling of winning. It is something quieter and more durable. It is the experience of money becoming a neutral fact of your life rather than a source of ongoing tension. The bills arrive and get paid without drama. The opportunity appears and gets evaluated on its merits, rather than through the filter of financial necessity. The conversation about money with a partner or family member is a planning conversation rather than a crisis conversation. This shift happens at a different threshold for every person. It is not triggered by a specific number in all cases. It is triggered by the point at which passive income plus financial reserves combine to remove the existential threat that money poses to most people's daily lives. For some, that happens at $500,000 in assets. For others, it requires more. But it is a real and specific threshold, and crossing it produces a change in daily experience that is disproportionate to the financial change that caused it. The person who has crossed that threshold does not think about money less. They think about it differently. It is no longer a problem to be managed. It is a tool to be directed. The anxiety becomes strategy. The fear becomes planning. The exhausting low-grade vigilance of financial fragility converts into the calm efficiency of financial management. That conversion is what wealth actually feels like from the inside. Not triumph, not arrival. Simply the removal of a constraint that was so constant and familiar you may not have fully noticed how much of your mental and emotional bandwidth it was consuming until it was gone. Here is the honest final observation of this chapter. Most people are trying to build the appearance of that feeling rather than the substance of it. They are buying the signals that they associate with financial arrival: the car, the address, the watch, in search of the feeling underneath. But the feeling doesn't come from the signals. It comes from the structure, from the passive income, from the redundancy, from the floor that doesn't fall through. The signals are available at any income level if you're willing to borrow enough. The structure requires years of patient building and the willingness to look ordinary in the meantime. The genuinely wealthy made that trade. Most of them would tell you it was the easiest trade they ever made, though most of them won't, because the genuinely wealthy tend not to talk about it much. They're too busy doing something else with their time. Chapter 14. The Compounding Life. Every principle in this book points toward one idea. The most powerful force in your financial life is not income, not intelligence, not timing, not luck. It is the consistent application of correct behavior over sufficient time. That's compounding. Not just as a financial mechanism, but as a life principle. The same mathematics that converts $500 a month into $1.7 million over 30 years also converts one good financial decision into a habit into a system, and a system into a life that looks completely different from the one you started with. Most people understand compounding as a number concept. Interest on interest. Returns on returns. The exponential curve that starts almost flat and then bends sharply upward after years of patience. They understand it intellectually and underestimate it practically because the early period, the flat part of the curve, feels like nothing is happening. Something is happening. The foundation is being laid that the entire structure will eventually stand on. The compounding is real even when it's invisible. Even when the portfolio balance feels trivial. Even when the monthly contribution feels insignificant relative to the distance between where you are and where you want to be. The flat part of the curve is where most people quit. It is also where the outcome is determined. Here's the first retention beat. Compounding requires 3 things and only 3 things. Correct direction, consistent action, and sufficient time. Remove any one of them and the mechanism fails. Add all 3 and it becomes, over long enough periods, nearly unstoppable. Correct direction means your money is pointed toward assets that generate return rather than toward consumption that produces nothing. It means your financial architecture is oriented toward ownership rather than pure income. It means your decisions are made with the long-term position in mind, rather than the short-term comfort. Consistent action means the contributions continue regardless of how the market feels this month, how confident you feel this quarter, or how significant the amounts feel this year. Consistency is what converts a good idea into an actual financial outcome. The investor who contributes every month for 30 years without exception will significantly outperform the investor who contributes more enthusiastically but less consistently. The market rewards showing up. Sufficient time means you started early enough or are starting now, which is the earliest possible remaining moment. Every day the compounding clock runs. Every day you are either on it or you are not. The ideal time to have started was 20 years ago. The second ideal time is today. Not next month when things settle. Not next year when you have more clarity. Today, with whatever amount is available, pointed in the correct direction. The second retention beat. The compounding life extends beyond money. This is where the principle becomes genuinely powerful in a way that purely financial conversations miss. The same mechanism that grows invested money grows knowledge, relationships, skills, and reputation. Every book you read on finance, investing, business, or human behavior compounds into better decisions the following year. Every relationship built with integrity compounds into a network that opens doors years later. Every skill developed compounds into capability that increases your income potential and your ownership options. The person who reads one book on investing this year and applies one principle will be meaningfully more financially capable next year than they are today. The person who does this for 10 years is unrecognizable from the person they were at the start. Not because of dramatic transformation, but because of the quiet accumulation of small improvements that compound into a fundamentally different level of financial intelligence. This is why the wealthy tend to get wealthier, not just through their existing assets, but through their continued learning. They are compounding the knowledge that generates the decisions that grow the assets. The three elements reinforce each other. Knowledge improves decisions. Decisions build assets. Assets provide the time and resources for more learning. The loop is self-reinforcing once it starts. The challenge is starting it. Here's a practical illustration of the compounding life in action. Consider two people at age 30. The first decides this is the year they take financial education seriously. They read 4 books on investing and personal finance. They open an investment account and begin contributing $400 a month. They restructure one financial habit, redirecting what was monthly consumption into monthly investment. They do this for 1 year. The second person intends to do the same, but waits for a better time, for less financial pressure, for more clarity about which approach is best. They don't start. At age 40, the first person has a decade of compounding knowledge and a growing investment portfolio. They have made hundreds of financial decisions informed by understanding rather than impulse. Their asset column exists and is growing. Their financial anxiety has measurably decreased. Their options have meaningfully expanded. The second person has a decade of good intentions and the financial position they had at 30, slightly adjusted for whatever happened to them along the way. The gap between them is not primarily the portfolio difference, though that difference is real and significant. The gap is in financial capability, confidence, and the structural position from which the next decade's decisions will be made. The third retention beat. The compounding life is not a sprint and not a grind. It is a direction maintained over time. This is the reframe that makes it sustainable rather than exhausting. The people who burn out on financial self-improvement are almost always approaching it as a sprint. Aggressive saving that feels like deprivation. Investment contributions that require constant sacrifice of things they actually value. A relationship with money characterized by tension and willpower rather than direction and habit. The compounding life doesn't require that intensity. It requires orientation, knowing which direction the decisions should lean. Building the automatic systems that execute that orientation without requiring daily willpower. Making the structural changes once, the automatic investment, the redirected allocation, the asset purchase, and then letting time do the work that effort alone never could. This is why the advice is not to cut every expense to the bone and invest every available dollar with maximum aggression. That is a sprint. It produces results for a while and then produces abandonment. The advice is to build the correct architecture, make it automatic, and then live your life while the compounding runs in the background. The wealthy are not, in most cases, obsessively monitoring their portfolios and making constant adjustments. They built systems aligned with correct principles and then left them largely alone for the time required to produce the outcomes they wanted. The discipline was front-loaded. The patience was ongoing. The result was compounding that required nothing from them on a daily basis, except the commitment to not interfere. Here's the final observation of this chapter, and it is one worth keeping. The compounding life produces its most dramatic results in the period that feels most ordinary. The years when the portfolio is growing but not yet life-changing. When the knowledge is accumulating but not yet fully expressed in your decisions. When the direction is correct, but the destination still feels distant. Those years are not the waiting room for the real story. They are the real story. The compounding is happening. The foundation is building. The outcome is being determined in the quiet accumulation of consistent, correct behavior that looks from the outside like nothing much at all. Most people want to skip that period. They want the bend in the curve without the flat part that precedes it. The flat part is not optional. It is the price of the bend. Pay it willingly. The mathematics on the other side of it are worth every ordinary day it costs. Conclusion. You've always had access to this. That's the part nobody tells you at the beginning, because it would remove the drama from the revelation. The rules that govern money were never locked away from you. The principles that separate financial freedom from financial servitude were never the exclusive property of a particular class or income bracket. They were sitting in plain sight the entire time, available to anyone willing to look directly at them rather than around them. What was missing wasn't access. It was awareness. And awareness, once it exists, cannot be unfollowed. Here's what you now understand that you didn't before. Money is mechanical, not mysterious. It follows rules with the consistency of physics. It flows toward value, compounds with time, responds to direction, and abandons neglect. None of that is poetic. All of it is operational. You understand that the beliefs you carry about money are already reflected in your financial position with uncomfortable accuracy. That the scripts you inherited were written for environments that no longer exist and by people who were doing their best with what they knew. That those scripts can be rewritten, not through affirmation, but through repeated action that eventually makes the old story implausible. You understand that effort caps and systems don't. That income is not wealth. That debt is a tool whose outcome depends entirely on what you point it at. That the emotional responses you experience around money are not character flaws, but biological factory settings that require structural management rather than willpower suppression. You understand that time is the variable that matters most, and that every day of delay has a specific, calculable cost that is significantly larger than the amount delayed. That freedom is a number, not a feeling, and that number is reachable through arithmetic and patience rather than through luck or exceptional circumstance. You understand what ownership actually means and what wealth actually feels like from the inside. Not the performance of it, the substance. None of this guarantees anything. Markets move in directions that models don't predict. Life produces expenses that plans don't anticipate. Uncertainty is permanent, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What changes with understanding is not the certainty of outcomes. It is the quality of decisions. And decisions made consistently with correct understanding over sufficient time produce outcomes that are not guaranteed, but are dramatically more probable than the outcomes produced by drift. This is where most books leave you, with the knowledge and the implicit assumption that knowledge automatically converts into action. It doesn't. Knowledge is potential. Action is the conversion. The conversion happens in the next decision you make about money. Not the dramatic one, the ordinary one. The one that happens this week when the surplus appears and you decide where it goes. The one that happens next month when the contribution is due and something else wants that money. The one that happens next year when the market falls and every instinct says to move. Those decisions are where this book either mattered or it didn't. There is nothing left to wait for. No better time, no higher income, no clearer moment when starting will feel more obvious or less costly. The cost of starting is always present tense. The cost of not starting is always future tense, which makes it feel smaller than it is, right up until it isn't. The rules are now visible. The direction is clear. The compounding clock is running. What happens next is not a circumstance. It is a choice.